Ultralight spinning reels, my friends, that's what we're talking about today.
Holy smokes.
Now, over the last couple years, I've gotten a lot of questions on what I look for in a spinning reel for ultralight fishing, and that's exactly what I plan to talk about. I'm going to go through some of these key things that I look out for when it comes to making my choice, but before I get into those key things, I did want to clarify just a couple quick things. Number one, I'm not really going to go deep into what brand you should choose today because I do think that most spinning reel brands are pretty darn good. I think that there's not a lot of variation necessarily between a spinning reel. They're all kind of the same thing. So ultimately, my suggestion would be to buy from a brand that you know and trust. If you're confident in your Pflueger, go with Pflueger. If you like your Daiwa, go with Daiwa, so on and so forth. I have my own personal preference and you should have yours too. The other thing I wanted to mention when it comes to brands is they have slightly different sizing names sometimes. Most reels use like the size 1000, 2000, 3000 system, but some other companies like Pflueger, Abu Garcia, they use size 20, 25, 30, 35, 40. So there's some slight differences. So if that confuses you, please don't hesitate to drop a comment below and I can help as best I can. But ultimately, you can usually kind of tell what sizes match up by just comparing line capacity. So for example, a size 20 Pflueger and a size 500 Shimano are pretty dang similar. A size 25 Pflueger is a little bit more like a size 1000 Daiwa or Shimano. So that's a good way to think about it. Now, with all that being said, let's get into those three key things that I look for when it comes to choosing a spinning reel. The first and arguably most important, line capacity. My friends, we all know that as ultralight anglers, we're oftentimes using low diameter line, 2-pound test, 4-pound test, 6-pound braid, the list goes on. The point is that line capacity is an important equation for us because most of the reels out there have plenty of space. The goal would be to find a reel that has enough line capacity for you, but maybe not too much, right? Because if you have too much, that's just costing you money in line. The one thing about a spinning reel that you need to remember is that it is only effective at casting when you fill it up properly. If you don't have enough line on a reel, it is going to have line twist issues, it's not going to cast as far, it's going to lead to a lot of problems. So ideally you fill it up, you don't fill it up too much, you kind of get it right to that sweet spot. Right here is kind of that sweet spot. You know, got a little bit of lip left in the spool, but not so much. So if I was to underfill this reel, I'd have a lot of problems. So what is my point there? The point is if you get something that has 300 yards of line capacity, then you're gonna burn through an entire 300 yard spool just to fill it up. But if you never need 300 yards of line, then what was the point? You're just spending more money on line than you need. So the goal would be to choose a reel that has enough line capacity for your needs, but not necessarily too much. Now, that leads me to my next point. Spool diameter. This is a thing that they don't unfortunately list in the specs, so you kind of just have to go out there and look at reels and get a feel for this. But spool diameter is equally as important, I would say, because ultimately we're casting really lightweight stuff and spool diameter affects how well that casts like a lot, right? So this reel right here, this is a reel that I have fished with quite a lot and I don't like it at all. This is a size 20 Pflueger. It's too small for proper casting ability. Why? Because that spool diameter is extremely low. So what does that do? It makes the line wrap around the spool much tighter. So that causes more memory, and also when it comes off the spool, it just doesn't come off as fast. You don't get that same level of like inertia, and you're not casting near as far with those light weights. So this reel right here, I do not like for my style of fishing because I can never get the kind of casting distance or efficiency on the water because it has a lot more line twist and it's just not as comfortable to fish with. So I would say don't make your decision only on line capacity because smaller reels like this might say, oh, I get 70 yards of 4-pound test and that's perfect for me. Unfortunately, you're sacrificing a lot of effectiveness by choosing that smaller spool size. So I would say personally, I would rather choose something with a little bit too much line capacity that has the proper spool diameter as opposed to choosing something with a small spool diameter that holds, unfortunately, the right amount of line. So that actually leads me to another point. I wish that America did a better job of this. I don't know why the reel companies in America don't offer shallow spooled options. This is actually a reel that my friends Bob and John actually sent to me, and it's from Japan. And the thing about it is a lot of these companies overseas, so this is like a JDM Daiwa right here, they make them shallow spooled models. So a shallow spooled model is essentially, hey, it's still got that same diameter spool of a size 1000, but it has a much shallower spool, so you don't have to put 300 yards of line on it. You can just put what you need on there. And that leads to more casting efficiency, and that leads to less waste of line, and also it's gonna be less weight in the reel. Okay, so that's my next point actually, is weight. When it comes to choosing an ultralight reel, you really need to think about weight, but not necessarily always the lightest. Just because something is light doesn't always make it better. That was kind of my mentality for the longest time, but as I've been testing more rods, what I've really realized is that it's more important to have a heavier reel that balances properly than have a super lightweight reel that ends up making your rod tip, too heavy, right? So for example, here we have my Temple fork rod. This is a 6-foot rod, and then I've got this size 1000 Shimano on there. And as you can see, that balances really well right here, right? This is a size 1000 reel. It's about 7.5 ounces. And with this rod right here, this is a very nice balance. Now, if I was using a lighter reel, this might actually be a tip heavy rod. So for example, we've got another Temple fork here. This is a 5'6" model, but this is a size 500 Shimano, which is a little bit smaller. Again, I don't particularly love this reel because it's got a narrower spool, but at the end of the day, this reel does balance quite well with this 5'6" model. Ultimately, your comfort on the water really relies on the balance of your equipment. And I would say that it's not always about having the lightest weight gear. It's more about having gear that you're comfortable with and that balances properly. So make sure to think about that as well. And that's kind of something that you don't always see in the specs when it comes to choosing a reel. It's just something you have to kind of get a feel for. So I'm not trying to intimidate you necessarily. What I would tell you is that personally, what I've found, 90% of the time, a size 1000 Daiwa or Shimano does perfect for me. The size 1000 usually has way more line capacity than I would ever actually need, but at the same time, it's not so much that I'm actually just wasting a ton of line. And the other thing is, it tends to balance extremely well with most ultralights in the 5'6" to 6'6" range. Unfortunately, a lot of ultralight rods that are 7 foot and above, they're a lot of times tip heavy, and if you use a little bit heavier reel, you can make them balance a little bit better. But that's been a challenge that I've been trying to figure out for some time now, and I still haven't quite figured it out. So if you have any suggestions as far as making a 7+ foot ultralight balance properly, let me know. So that's pretty much my system: line capacity, spool diameter, and reel weight. If I was going to summarize it in one closing statement, it would be the goal is to choose a reel that has the least amount of line capacity possible to do the job for you, while still having a spool diameter that's wide enough to cast effectively. And oh, by the way, the reel is chosen in a weight that's going to balance properly with your rod. If you can marry those three things up, you're gonna have a great time on the water. And I can tell you, I know I didn't get into drag power today. I didn't get into how many bearings the reel had. I didn't get into price points. And the reason is because I just don't think those things matter as much as a lot of times we think. Quite honestly, I've used Pfluger, I've used Luz, I've used Quantum, I've used Daiwa, I've used Shimano. Most of these spinning reels are pretty darn good. There's nothing necessarily wrong with them. My personal preference, I like Daiwa and Shimano, size 1000. That reel right there in most of their models, from $40 all the way up to $250, is always good. I've caught just as many fish on my Daiwa Revros LT1000, which is $45. I've caught just as many fish on that than I have on this Tatula, and it's done just fine. I've caught big pike and carp, and it's held up great, and the drag has done extremely well. So I guess my point is that I think it's a pretty level playing field with spinning reels. The more you spend, the higher quality components you get. So if you want to spend a lot of money and have something that's going to last you probably a lifetime, then you spend a little bit more. But if you want something that's just going to get the job done, and it may end up having some mechanical issues at some point, that's going to be, those $40 and $50 reels. They're going to do just fine for probably many years, but they may give out at some point. Anyways, I'm rambling at this point. Next time I do a video, I'm going to be on the water catching fish. I'm not going to be sitting in this room. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions, drop them in the comments below. Otherwise, we'll catch you next time.